Good afternoon, everyone. Gordon Causey coming to you on this. It is right now Thursday, the 10th of October, 2024. And with everything happening in the news right now, in particular with Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of Canada's Conservative Party and leader of the official opposition in Canada's government, having spoken so eloquently and forcefully on his support for the nation state of Israel, I felt it somewhat incumbent upon myself. Makes me sound like I have a bit of a bloated ego, but whatever the case, I've wanted to add my voice and to enumerate the reasons why I support Israel. Normally, when I do my videos, I always do them live just because it's easier than recording something and then uploading it. So I like to do things live. But actually, what I will be doing is reading something that I posted to my Facebook timeline just a few minutes ago. It took me about an hour to write it. And in reading it, I can take out any syntax and grammatical errors I made. I have John 5 has shown up listening to me from work. Well, you're going to listen to me read because you and others now are jumping on. I'm going to be reading what I wrote to my Facebook timeline. These are the reasons that I support Israel. I'm standing right now, or sitting rather, right now in my junk room. It's an old army cot and the Canadian flag, American flag, somewhat representative of myself, given that I'm Canadian born to Canadian parents, but I did spend 10 years growing up in this country down here in the United States. Spent 10 years down there. And something happened in the news today that also brought it to mind, and I'll be talking about that with what I wrote. And this is what I wrote now 38 minutes ago. I posted it to my Facebook timeline. This is why I stand with Israel. And the primary reason I'm doing this is I want to speak to those who support the Palestinian cause and who support groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And both Hezbollah and Hamas are at war with Israel. And many in my network, I know that there is a lot of support out there, and they agree with the aim to eliminate Israel from existence and to basically, quote unquote, to return the land to the Palestinians. And I understand this outlook, at least I believe I do. We see the images coming out of places like Gaza and southern Lebanon. And of course, there were also the atrocities that occurred on October 7th, and they were horrific. But the response by Israel has been even more devastating because war is an ugly affair. When military conflict erupts, civilian populations suffer. Look at World War I or World War II, countless civilians. Look at what happened in Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or you don't even have to go back into World War I and II. You can go just back to the more recent Yemeni civil war. There's been a civil war in Yemen. It's still ongoing, but the hostilities have died down, but it's lasted about 10 years. And in Yemen, it's reckoned that 400,000 men, women, and children have been killed or have died as a result of that war. And further, over 200,000 children under the age of 5 in Yemen have died as a result of that war. War is brutal. And we sometimes hear this chant, "Death to Israel," or words similar to, of similar effect. And they're being heard in Canadian cities and in many countries all around the world, in the United States, Western Europe. And there are now, even right now as I speak, and what somewhat led me to doing this, writing the post that I wrote and reading it now, there are videos circulating and there are stories being written in both mainstream and alternative media outlets. And there are protesters who are chanting "Death to Canada" at these pro-Palestinian rallies. And the predominating narrative for those who support the Palestinian cause and groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and it's Hezbollah and Hamas that are prosecuting this war against Israel. Well, the narrative is that Israel is that European Jews, European Jewry, stole the land from native Palestinian inhabitants of that region. Uh, and the situation in Israel is incredibly complex. So, to a degree, I can understand the desire. You want to break things down into a simple narrative, something that's simple enough for even a first grader to understand, a 6 year old. And children understand that when someone comes and takes something that belongs to someone else, well, that's wrong. But life isn't always, grade one simple. Most are aware that up until the First World War, this territory that is often referred to as Palestine, that it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, also sometimes called the Turkish Empire. And the Turks ruled the region for just over 400 years, things like 402 or 403, so 400 years. And so Turkey was the colonial power before Britain took over. And before the Turks, there were periods of Egyptian, Arabian, Byzantine, even the European Christian Crusaders had rule over the region. But I figure 400 years of Ottoman rule, that seems as good a starting point as any. And during the Ottoman rule, when the Ottomans were ruling Palestine, they did allow Jewish people to continue living in what had been their ancestral homeland. The rules for Jews living under Ottoman rule, they went up and down, they ebbed and flowed. There were periods of tolerance, periods of persecution. Jews were always second class compared to Muslims, but the Ottomans were often less repressive than many European countries. Then you have the First World War breaking out, and some Jews who were living in that area was actually the southern part of the Syrian province of Syria. That's what the Ottomans called it. It was part of their Syrian province. Some of the Jews living in that area were willing to go and fight alongside the Ottoman Turks. They wanted to ally themselves with the Ottoman Turks because, as I noted, and you can check this out historically, oftentimes Jews found living under Ottoman rule less repressive than living under European rule. So they were willing to fight alongside them. However, their overtures were rebuffed. You can even read up on how Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, he recruited Jewish militia to fight with the Ottomans. And again, that's just simple history. So after World War I, of course, the Ottoman Empire was defeated by Britain and her allies, and rule over much of the Middle East, including Palestine, it fell to the Brits. And the formal mandate for Palestine was created in 1920. You can look into this. It was at a conference in San Remo, Italy. And at its inception, the mandate included all of present day Israel, and that's including the West Bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip. And it also included all of what is today Jordan. And this seems to be a little known, but you can easily verify that fact that the mandate, as it was established in 1920, included all of present day Israel, all of present day Jordan. And the original mandate for Palestine was much bigger than this little tiny strip the size of New Jersey that we call Israel today. And the reason that the fact that Jordan is also part of the original mandate, why that is forgotten about, and why people don't even know this, is because the Jordanian partition took place just 1 year after the mandate had been established. So Jordan came into being in April of 1921. So it was only for 1 year that the Palestinian mandate included all of Israel and all of Jordan. And at its creation, the Palestinian country of Jordan was actually called Transjordan because it was on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So it was across or trans the Jordan River, back when trans had a different meaning than what it does now. Transjordan was initially, it was a protectorate of Great Britain, but in 1946, they gained full autonomy from Britain, and the name was changed to simply Jordan. And to be fully accurate, the full name of country is actually the Hashemite Kingdom or Emirate of Jordan. And who are the Hashemites? Well, they were a ruling family from the Arabian Peninsula who were ousted from their lands by the House of Saud. This is why we call it Saudi Arabia today and not Hashemite Arabia. And because the Hashemites had allied themselves with the British during World War I, Britain gave them the largest chunk of Palestine to rule over. A year into their mandate, they said, here, we're going to give you 77% of Palestine to rule over. The Hashemites were also given rule in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, and Britain even tried to give the Hashemites rule over Syria, but Syria was in the French sphere. That was a French mandate, so the French kicked the Hashemites out of Syria. So while it's historically accurate to refer to present-day Jordan as a Palestinian state, that's what it is, most people are ignorant of the full history, and so they assume that Palestine, that all it ever included was present-day Israel. And when Transjordan was created as the first Palestinian state, the newly formed, this protectorate of Great Britain, was being ruled by a colonial power, these Arabian Hashemites. And what they did is they ethnically cleansed their new territory of its Jewish population. One town, which was called Tel Or, you have Tel Aviv, you have Tel this, there was a town in Transjordan called Tel Or, and it was allowed to have a Jewish population because it was the site of a hydroelectric facility providing power to this new country, and Transjordan needed Jewish expertise and Jewish money. So they allowed one Jewish town. The rest of the Jewish Palestinians living in this newly formed emirate state were forced to leave, and most of them, probably 99%, just moved back to, or they moved to what remained of the British mandate for Palestine. So that was 1920s. Now we move into the 30s and 40s. So the only Palestinians left are those who are still living in that tiny little remaining portion of the old British mandate. So the Palestinians living under the Arabian Hashemites, they're now Jordanians. And those still under British rule on the western side of the Jordan River, they were all Palestinians. There were Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Druze. If there were any Shintos, Hindus, Druids, or whatever, anyone living in that area, no matter what they were, you would be a Palestinian. But the question now begs, who are the people living in the British mandate for Palestine, and where did they come from? Who were they? Well, around 1946, in terms of numbers, there were about 800,000 Jewish Palestinians living alongside roughly double the number of Muslims, and then smaller communities of Christians and Druze. And some of those Jewish Palestinians had ancestors who had been living in the land going back millennia, because the Jewish presence in the Holy Lands had never completely disappeared, although at times the total number dropped below 10,000. Other Jews emigrated to the land when it was still under colonial Ottoman rule. And later, even more came in after Britain took control as the colonial power from the Ottomans. And now comes what I consider a very important point, vitally important. If we go back to the 18th and 19th century, it is reckoned that the entire southern region of the Ottoman province of Syria, what we call Israel today, the total population by the mid-1800s was less than 500,000, very sparsely populated area. Jewish immigration into what had been their ancestral homeland did not really start taking off until late in the 19th century, late in the 1800s. It was something of the brainchild of a man by the name of Theodor Herzl. And according to all the historical evidence I've been able to garner and look at, Herzl was not a religious man at all, but he did identify as Jewish ethnically and culturally. And in looking at the manner in which European Jewry had been treated over the century, he advocated for Jews to return to their ancestral homeland, and basically the Zionist movement took root. So it wasn't necessarily entirely a religious movement. Herzl himself was very secular, but identifying as Jewish culturally and ethnically, and seeing the persecution that had been taking place for centuries in Europe, thought the only place that someone who identifies as Jewish, be it Jewish religiously, ethnically, or culturally, the only place to live peacefully would be in the ancestral homeland, Zion, or Judah, or Judea, or Israel. But what was the land like before the Jews started moving into the region? There are some Jews living there, but like I say, the population ebbed and flowed. Sometimes it got down under 10,000. What was the land like during this time in the 1700s, 1800s? And we have a number of historical accounts describing the land and its inhabitants. The most famous visitor to the Holy Land was probably Mark Twain, famous American writer, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, etc. And he visited the country or that area in 1867. But he wasn't the only one. There was a gentleman by the name of Frederick Hasselquist, who was a Swedish academic. He studied flora and fauna, botany, I guess, and he visited the region in the 1750s. There was a British diplomat. His name was William Turner. He traveled to the region in around 1820. Felix Beauvais was a French theologian, and he visited the Holy Lands in 1858. And the description, these individuals, and these are the notable ones, others did as well. There are other individuals who wrote, but these were somewhat prominent. You have an academic, a theologian, famous writer, they gave their description of the land was like what it was like prior to Jewish immigration. They're in lockstep agreement. They universally describe Palestine as being basically very sparsely populated and desolate. Mark Twain's description, the man's a writer, so he's very eloquent, and this is the way he described it. The further we went, the hotter the sun got. The more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. And you can read all the descriptions of what the Holy Lands was like in the 1700s, 1800s. And that's the description: bare, desolate, very sparsely populated. You can go for hours without seeing a single human being. And why was this land, why were the Holy Lands in such decay? It's understandable because it was a holding of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was in decline. By the time that we get into the 1850s, 60s, Ottoman rule was only 60 years from ending. Their empire was in decline. And as empires collapse, colonial holdings suffer, and the land of Palestine was no exception. It was in decline. But as Jews began moving into the area in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were bringing capital, they were bringing expertise, they were bringing know-how, and businesses were created, farms were established, and the land started to be rejuvenated. And with this, now, and it was Jewish led. It was Jews coming back into their ancestral homeland who were rejuvenating the land, opening up these businesses, these farms, and so that led to Arab immigration into the area. The Jews came in, started to establish economic opportunity, and Arabs, like anyone, you see economic opportunity. Look at the oil sands in Alberta. When oil is booming in Alberta, all kinds of people moved to Fort McMurray. When the Jews moved back into their ancestral homeland and started to rejuvenate the land, Arabs started to come in because, hey, there's work here now. I want to be clear on one specific point, though. The number of Arabs coming into Palestine was greater than the number of Jews. Jewish immigrants were they were the capitalists. They were the ones creating the businesses, starting up the farms, and the Arabs were largely the ones working. And there were always more executives than there are laborers. There are always more workers than there are owners. That's just economic reality. But the central point is that we have two immigrant populations moving into what you can call Palestine, if you want. There were Jews, predominantly European, maybe some Americans as well, and some other populations, but it was predominantly European, moving in, as well as Arabs. And so both could be described as colonials, if you like, if you want to use that term. So, as I noted earlier, around 1860, the total population of this area, it's still at this point the southern Ottoman province of Syria, less than 500,000. But by the end of World War I, that number had grown to, in and around 700,000. So the population's growing. And then the British made a commitment toward establishing a Jewish national homeland in Palestine with their famous Balfour Declaration, November of 1917. And that led to even more Jewish immigration into the area. And then when we get to 1947, that's the year before war broke out between Jewish Palestinians and neighboring Arab League countries. Now, by 1947, the entire population is getting up in around 2 million, of which 700,000 to 800,000 are Jewish Palestinians. So it's still predominantly Arab Muslim, but a sizable number, 700,000 to 800,000 Jewish Palestinians. That's more than the total population of Palestine back under Ottoman rule in the middle of the 1800s. And another point I want to be clear on is that the conflict in Palestine, it only really seriously began after the British took over. Because basically Britain had made it clear that they weren't interested in ruling over the Middle East in the same way the Ottoman Turks had done. They weren't going to be ruling like the Ottomans. They were interested in creating basically what I will call client states, like they did with the establishment of the first Palestinian state, Transjordan. So those left in what remained of the British Mandate, what's left of Palestine, they wanted the same deal that the Hashemites from the Arabian Peninsula got. The Jewish Palestinian wanted rule over at least some of the remaining mandate, and the Arab Palestinians wanted all of what remained. And both populations, both the Arab Palestinians and the Jewish Palestinians, they both knew the British wanted out. So they started fighting with each other, and they both started also fighting with the British. And everything that's happened since then, it's just more history. Britain walked away from its mandate. They had an expiry date. It was May 15, 1948. So their rule expired and they vacated. They left. They didn't hand anyone anything. They just vacated. And what ensued was a war between roughly 800,000 Jewish Palestinians who were living in the land and 5 invading armies of the Arab League. I mentioned the 5 many times. I actually didn't write it down in my post. But the 5 invading nations were Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So 5 nations of what is called the Arab League invaded, and the Jewish Palestinians living in the land had to fight against them. And when the war ended, which came in March of 1949, basically that what remained of the British Mandate, it got carved up. Jordan got control of the West Bank of the Jordan River, and they got East Jerusalem. Egypt gained control of the Gaza Strip. And what both Egypt and Jordan did, they ethnically cleansed their newly acquired lands of their respective Jewish populations. And the Jewish Palestinians gained control over the remainder, and they established it as the new Jewish nation state of Israel. So if everything had ended there, all would be well and good. The Palestinian Arabs living on the west bank of the Jordan, along with those in East Jerusalem, they were now Jordanians. So no more Palestinians, you're now Jordanians. The Arab Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, They were now Egyptians. No more Palestinians. You're not Palestinians anymore. Now you're Egyptians. And the Jewish Palestinians living in the rest, in the remainder, they were now Israelis. So Palestine as an entity no longer exists. The British are gone, and the population of that mandate had been divided up into Jordanians, Israelis, and Egyptians. They're all former Palestinians, but now they have new identities because Palestine doesn't exist. The problem is that the invading Arab nations had been basically, they'd been humiliated. They had failed to completely annihilate a one-day-old country. Basically 800,000 at most former Arab Palestinians had fled the fighting. About 800,000 Arab Palestinians got out of Dodge, and they thought that they would be able to return because you've got 5 nations against a one-day-old nation, just 800,000 Jewish Palestinians. The Jewish Palestinians are going to get wiped out. They're all either going to be killed or driven out. And then the Arab Palestinians figured they'd be able to come back. The Jewish Palestinians were not expected to win anything. It was a humiliating defeat, a catastrophe, or I think the Arab word is Nakba. I think that's an Arabic word, Nakba, or sometimes spelled Naqba. So after that catastrophe in 1967, now we move forward, and Egypt forms an alliances actually too. They were allied with both Jordan and Syria. Both Jordan and Syria had been involved in that initial war, and now they were joined again. And what the Egyptians started to do is they started massing troops and tanks on the Egyptian-Israeli border along the Egyptian Sinai. They put their tanks and their soldiers ready for an invasion of Israel. And then Egypt threatened to blockade Israeli shipping through what are called the Straits of Tiran. And the Israelis warned Egypt, if you blockade our shipping, that this would be taken as a declaration of war, or the proper term is casus belli. It's the Latin legal term. Basically, you're declaring war on us. And Egypt's Nasser, the leader of Egypt, he disregarded that warning and he went ahead with the blockade. So what resulted was a war, and it became known as the Six-Day War. And this time, Israel defeated the forces of 3 nations. So the first war, 1948-49, they had to defeat 5, and they didn't win everything, but they were able to establish themselves as a nation. This time it was 3 nations that they defeated, and they seized territory from all of them. From Egypt, they got the Gaza Strip as well as the Sinai Peninsula. From Jordan, they captured the west bank of the Jordan River as well as East Jerusalem. And from Syria, they took a strategically important piece of territory called the Golan Heights. And so basically for the Arab world, it was another Nakba, another humiliating and catastrophic defeat against a tiny and very lightly populated little Jewish nation state. You know, I equate it to a high school basketball team defeating the LA Lakers. And probably what is the most, in my view, the most important development of the 1967 Six-Day War is this planted the seeds of a new national identity, that of a Palestinian, something that had never really existed before. If you were, before the British, before World War I, anyone living in this area, they were citizens of the Ottoman Empire. Then for about 28 years, they'd been under British rule. So they were, citizens of a British holding. And then from 1948 until 1967, those who had been Palestinian were either Israelis, they were Jordanians, or they were Egyptians. But after that 1967 war, the people of Gaza and the West Bank became a people without a national or political identity. They weren't part of the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't exist anymore. They weren't part of the British Empire. They vacated the territory. And now Jordan had lost the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Egypt had lost the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. So after that 1948-49 war, the Egyptians and Jordanians, they expelled the Jewish population from their newly conquered territory, and the Jews were welcomed into Israel. Okay, you got kicked out of the West Bank of Jordan. Okay, come into Israel. If you got kicked out of Gaza, come into Israel. But the Egyptians and Jordanians refused to do likewise for their citizens after they lost the Six-Day War. So after they lost, when Israel lost territory, they welcomed their citizens. They welcomed their people. But the Egyptians and Jordanians refused to welcome their people into their country after Israel had defeated them. Israel was left basically with a hostile population that were seething at the prospect of being governed by people who had formerly been Jewish Palestinians. It was another Nakba, and that's when the uprising started. And there are too many for me to enumerate these intifadas or uprisings. And in my eyes, Israel's biggest mistake was in not dealing with the Arab population in the same manner that the Arab states dealt with their Jewish populations. Arab states expelled Jews after the First War, after that 1948-49 First Arab-Israeli War. The Arab states expelled the Jews. And I think Israel should have done likewise. But I guess as a modern Western style, Western democracy, Israel was held to a different standard than their Arab neighbors, their democracy. So the seeds of a Palestinian identity were established, and all you had was a recipe for endless war. And ultimately, the power behind the Palestinian cause, here and now, is the nation of Iran, what was once called the seat of the old Persian Empire. And in Iranian Shia Islamic doctrine, Israel is the devil. They are the little Satan. The big devil, or the big Satan, is the United States. And that is why we're hearing chants of death to Canada in our own streets from supporters of Iran's proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Because in the minds of those steering this ideology, once Israel is defeated, they think it's a foregone conclusion that Israel will be defeated. Once they defeat Israel, then the attack can shift to the big Satan. And Canada, in the eyes of this ideology, we're part of the United States. Anyone thinking along these lines, America is not just the United States of America, it's the entire American hegemony, or Pax Americana, if you prefer that term. Now, Israel will not fail. That's a statement of faith. My faith informs me that the nation state of Israel will not fail, and that the Jewish nation state will stand. But if Israel were to fall, then the extremist Islamic jihadist types would turn their attention to Western nations, including Canada. And I'm a proud Canadian. And as such, I stand with those nations who stand against the forces that want to see Canada destroyed. So that's why I stand with Israel. Peace, and yes, peace will come. That's what I wrote. I've got a number of people writing. Sojourner Dynamis deleted. He written, bonjour, mon ami. Brett Skinner writing, good afternoon. I have Tassif Hussein. By all means, stand by Israel, but do have a thought in your heart for the thousands of babies and kids in Palestine who have lost their limbs, parents. I feel bad for the kids of Gaza, for the population of southern Lebanon, the same way I feel for the 200,000 plus killed children in Yemen under the age of 5 who have been killed in that violence between the Iranian-backed Houthis and the Saudi-backed Yemeni government forces. Violence is horrible. War is horrific. We saw what happened on October 7th. I don't know how you respond to it. War is brutal. And even if, and again, I said at the end of my little post, reading the post that I've just written. I said at the end of that, peace will come. But even if it didn't, or even let's say Israel was defeated, would that bring peace to the region? No, no. You'd have Sunni on Shia violence, like what we're seeing in Yemen. You like we've seen with ISIS in Syria, like we've seen throughout the Middle East. Just eliminating Israel doesn't bring peace to the Middle East, because we're dealing with Hashemites and the House of Saud and the Sunni and the Shia and the Druze and everyone else. You just get rid of the Jews. There's only 7-8 million Jews living in Israel. There are hundreds of millions of Islamic Arabs living in the area, and Persians and Egyptians and Turks and everyone. They'll start fighting. So thank you for your comment, Tassif. John 5 is writing, it is difficult to get proper Middle East and Israel war history. Well, that's because it's largely clouded. And the simple fact of the matter is everyone wants the moral high ground, and everyone wants to, in most cases, they won't even acknowledge their own sins. They won't even acknowledge the things that they have done wrong. Everyone wants to, both sides want to portray themselves as the ultimate in virtue. And the fact of the matter is there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. Both Arab and Jewish Palestinians, because they're all Palestinians, both are broken, fallen peoples, and both are as prone to atrocities as the other. How do you, evil is evil is evil. War is horrible. War in of itself is a crime against humanity. And this is such an incredibly difficult situation. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with having a population in Gaza and in the West Bank of the Jordan River, what Jews call Judea Samaria, what people in cities, I think it's Hebron is there, what the Arabs call the West Bank. How is the nation state of Israel to deal with populations that want to see your entire nation taken over from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River right through to the Mediterranean? How do you govern a people that's ultimate goal is to eliminate you, wipe you off the map? It makes things entirely problematic. And as I was reading from my post, Israel's big mistake was in not dealing with the Arab Palestinian population in the same way that the Arab nations dealt with their Jewish populations. When Jordan conquered, after that 1948-1949 war, Jordan conquered the western bank of the Jordan River, and they kicked all the Jews out. Because the old maxim of to the victor go the spoils. Jordan said, we won. We're the victors. Jews, get out. And they did the same in East Jerusalem. They said, Jews, get out. There was a Jordanian commander who was bragging that for the first time in over 1,000 years, there are no Jews in the eastern quarter of Jerusalem. They ethnically cleansed it. And the world basically said, well, fair enough. You won. To the victor go the spoils. Israel should have done the same thing after the 1967 war when they conquered Gaza and the western bank of the Jordan River. They should have said, okay, we won. Now we're going to play by the same rules. To the victor go the spoils. Get out. The only thing is Jordan refused to accept its citizens back into what remained of their country, the Palestinian state of Jordan. They said, no, you can't come back here. You have to stay there. Almost like a Trojan horse. And Egypt likewise with the citizens of Gaza. They said, no, they're not Egyptians anymore. Now they're Palestinians. And that's, there was no real Palestinian identity before that 1967 war. It was a creation of that war because the people living in Gaza were Egyptians. The people living on the west bank of the Jordan, they were Jordanian. Then there are Jordanians who remarked that I woke up one day and I went from being a Jordanian to being a Palestinian, and someone took the star off my flag. because the Jordanian flag is the Palestinian flag, and it simply has the Jordanian version of the Palestinian flag has a star in it, because Jordan is a Palestinian state, and they have a yellow star in the middle of the triangle. And the Palestinians just took the little star out, same flag. Let's read on. John 5. Sojourner Didymus is reading, talking about Romans 11:25. I know Romans 11 well. I have a copy of my King James Bible up here. But chapter 11 of Romans is where Paul is dealing with the fact that Christians, of which I am one, that we are grafted onto a cultivated Jewish vine, and that we're not to boast over the branches that have been cut off so that we could be grafted on, because those branches will be grafted back onto their own native vine, and how much more easily will they be grafted on than us Gentiles. Anyway, I don't know specifically 11:25. I'll grab the Bible and we'll take a look. What the heck? I got some time. Corinthians, John, Acts, Romans. And unfortunately, this is my great-grandmother's old Bible. And unfortunately, it's a little water damaged. And the writing's very small. 11:25 of the book of Romans, chapter 11, verse 25. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God. So that's what I was talking about. I know I've read chapter 11 of Romans many times. I've read the book of Romans many times, but I fixated on chapter 11 often. Thank you for that, Sojourner Didymus, a.k.a. Thomas. And Sojourner is saying that's why he cannot turn his back on Israel. It's God's chosen people, and God does not break his covenants. Israel has broken its covenants many times with God, but God does not break his covenants. Go back to Deuteronomy, read. This was foretold all the way back in Deuteronomy, a book that is said to have been written by Moses himself, that the Jews, that Israel would not uphold its end of the bargain, the covenant agreement with God. And God, speaking through Moses, said, these are the punishments the curses that will befall you, because you are going to turn away. You are going to fail to live up to your end of the bargain. God always promised, he said, here's the blessing, here's the curse. But when you read Deuteronomy toward the end, of Deuteronomy, I think it's 36 chapters in all. You get into chapter 34, 35. Moses is proclaiming, thus saith the Lord, you will fall away. You will break my covenant. But God always keeps up his end of the deal. God does not break his covenants. God's promises do not come back void. Anyway, going on. So that's why Sojourner Didymus stands with Israel. It's a religious, a spiritual, a scripturally based support. I support Israel for those same reasons, but I can also look beyond that to the historical context and look at the history of the region. And I'm willing to call out the log in Israel's eye, as well as the log in the eye of the Arab world. So going on, Danny, late, just noticed that I was live. Yeah, this is kind of an unscheduled one. Came about because I was reading and watching videos of a group in Vancouver, British Columbia, chanting "Death to Canada, death to Canada," a pro-Palestinian, the people who support Hamas and Hezbollah, which are at war with Israel, backed by the Shia Islamic State of Iran. And so they're yelling death to Canada. And ultimately, what I'm hoping the individuals who listen to this, I'm glad to see this Taseef Hussein with a name like Hussein. I'm assuming you're Islamic, and that is fine. Let's face it, in my theological view, in my religious view, you and I, Taseef, and everyone here, we're all fallen, we're all broken. And if anything comes out of this, I would love for people to get into relationship and to look basically Jesus Christ, who went to the cross. Your own Quran in the Islamic faith refers to Jesus as a prophet of God. He's not just a prophet. He's the Son of God. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. That's what Jesus says. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. When you have seen me, you have seen the Father. This is the Trinity, which is a difficult concept to wrap your head around. Think of God as having three natures: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. The best description I've heard of it is we know of H2O, water. One hydrogen, two oxygen molecules crammed together. However, water, H2O, can take on different forms. In the liquid form, it's water, liquid water. Then we have solid water, that's ice. And then we have liquid vapor or mist. They're all water, but in three different forms: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. All fully God, separate but the same. It's a difficult concept to wrap your mind around, and I have difficulty with it sometimes. Many Christians do. Anyway, the biggest difficult is in describing it. How do you describe something that's together as one but also unique? Something of a paradox. Anyway, Danny writes, I love these history lessons almost as much as the scripture readings. And he writes, amen, Jesus is king. And he is. And at one point in history, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. But until that day comes, we're to struggle on. We're to fight. And then Danny has to muddle things even further by throwing snow into the equation. It's not liquid, it's not solid, it's not gas, it's kind of mushy liquid. Thanks a lot for that, Danny. Make things even more confusing than they already are. And I don't even know if our friend Taseef Hussein is even still watching. And I hear you. I hear you with respect to the only thing I ask for people to do, yes, it is horrific what is happening in Gaza, what's happening in southern Lebanon. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt now, though, that groups like Hezbollah and Hamas do use the civilian population as human shields. Evidence of that fact is that this Nasrallah, I can't remember the first name now, the leader of Hezbollah had his military headquarters built underneath a residential complex. That you do not place a military command post underneath a civilian population. That in of itself is a war crime. Targeting civilians is a war crime. How do you combat against a force that commits a war crime? How do you combat against a force that's firing rockets every day, dozens of rockets, thousands over the past year, 6, 7, 8,000 rockets, missiles, drones have been fired from southern Lebanon by Hezbollah into northern Israel over the past year? Now, how do you defend yourself against that when the enemy doing it to you is hiding behind civilians and building military command posts underneath residential complexes? What do? Say, oh, well, I guess we just have to put up with thousands of rockets being drones and missiles being, sent to attack us, and we can't do anything about it because they're hiding behind civilians? Or do you say, well, we're going, do what Israel did. Say, look, if you're anywhere near Hezbollah installation, anywhere near Hezbollah equipment or infrastructure or assets that belong to Hezbollah, if you're anywhere near these facilities, get out of town because we're coming. And that's what Israel did. They announced to this Lebanese population, if you're anywhere near a Hezbollah asset, get away from it because we're going to attack it. And Danny's laughing at my remarks about snow, ice, and water and mist and all that other stuff. Well, you brought it up. Anyway, God bless everyone. I've gone on way longer than I thought I would. I didn't think anyone would show up on the live, but I appreciate that you did. If you enjoyed this, you're welcome to subscribe. You're welcome to hit the like button. And you're also welcome to comment. Fill the comment field. And even if you disagree with me, like Tassif Hussein, I appreciate dialogue. That's the way things get resolved in this world, is if we leave our echo chambers and if we're willing to venture out and talk to the other side. And I hope that there are others who were maybe triggered. Why is this guy supporting Israel? And so get out of their echo chamber and maybe hear the arguments. And if you're going to come at me, fair enough. Combat me with facts. Tassif Hussein wrote, asked me to have a heart for the babies and the kids who are losing their lives, like I do with the kids who are the 200,000 children under 5 in Yemen who have been killed. You know, sadly, we live in an ugly, satanic, they call Satan the prince of this world for a reason, but the king is above the prince. Jesus is the king of this world. And one day every knee will bow, one day every tongue will confess. We're not there yet, but we're moving toward that day. And until that day comes, may the Lord bless and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. And by inviting Jesus into your heart, know that the Lord will grant you peace. So until I do my next live, I'll talk to you later. In the interim, keep hitting that like button, keep subscribing. And you're welcome to fill that comment field. Amen, Danny. Talk to you all later. Night. Good afternoon.